whether it's community colleges, open access, regional publics, those are places that just need to do a better job of taking care of
Right.
students, helping give them guidance, treating them as human beings, acknowledging the complicated lives that they live, trying to provide the kinds of services that are going to be supportive to them, and also making the case to the students that, yeah, a practical degree is great, but don't forget the long game. You want to try and make sure you have those skills that are going to help you navigate a long career. It really is a proven package, and I think it's something colleges can do more with.
That was Ben Wildavsky, the author of the great book, The Career Arts. And we had a great conversation about how broad education plus targeted skills plus social capital equals success in college and life beyond. We talked about how it's not either or, getting an education versus getting a job. It's both and, especially in the age of AI, where students need to play the short game and the long game as they think about the careers they want to have and the lives they want to lead. So much of this conversation resonated with me because it aligns with my perspective that we spend way too much time thinking about where to go to college and not nearly enough about how to go to college. I bet it will for you too. Let's dive in. Welcome to the Connected College podcast. I'm your host, Elliot Felix. I've helped more than 100 colleges and universities change what they offer, how they operate, and how they're organized to enable student success. And if you're a leader in higher ed and you think that the silos and separations get in the way of student success, then this podcast and my book, The Connected College, are for you. We're here to learn and work together to bust silos, question tradition, and forge partnerships so that students feel connected to their college, their community, their coursework, and their careers. Welcome, Ben. I'm so excited for today's conversation about the career arts.
Thanks, Elliot. I'm really glad to be with you.
Tell me a little bit about how you got started in higher ed and what you're up to today.
I guess one way to answer that is that I'm a faculty brat. My dad
Nice.
was a professor at the University of California, Berkeley, so that's where I'm from originally. And I feel like I got interested in higher ed by osmosis. I always assumed that, like, when I would fill out those forms, like in high school, like for how many years of school do you plan, I would always say up to PhD because I thought that's what it was normal. And then
Amazing.
somewhere in college, I liked college, but I realized I didn't feel like I had that fire in the belly to really go out and be an academic or be a professor. So I'm like I feel like the last of the breed who just got a bachelor's degree, never did any kind of graduate school, but I became a journalist. And I gravitated toward education in my writing. I covered lots of different things over the years in economics and international trade and different stuff, but I really ended up loving education, both K-12 and higher ed, became the education editor for US News and World Report. So I was really mostly passionate about the policy topics that I would be covering and editing week in, week out. But of course, I was also in charge of the US News America's Best College Guides and the America's Best Graduate School Guides. And that was really fascinating, obviously controversial in some respects, hugely popular, but it really got me thinking a lot about the question about the return on investment education, what sort of information the public wants and needs to understand whether it's worthwhile going to a particular institution or whether college in general is worthwhile. So for about the last 19 years, I left full-time journalism, but ended up working in a series of kind of jobs at a foundation, at think tanks, at a couple of universities with affiliations. I was I guess, a professor of practice at SUNY for a few years. So I somehow ended up in that world, did a little bit of teaching, but really I've primarily been a writer, done some podcasting, I've done some consulting, organizing conferences and things like that. And I've just been fascinated by the question of what everyone's talking about now. Is college worthwhile? What kinds of colleges, what kinds of programs of study, for which students, what can we do to make it better? And of course, in the age of AI, there's like a whole different set of questions that are coming along. So I've just found this a really fascinating world.
It really is. And I love the story finding a career that allowed you a life of learning and a way of sharing what you were learning as you're talking to people and doing the research and creating the college guide or the college rankings. And I think we share that focus on ROI. My first book, How to Get the Most Out of College, is maybe adjacent to your book that we're going to talk about. It's such an important topic. I think thinking about not just where you go to college, but how you go to college and how you make the most of that experience and the relationships and the skills, I think is right where we ought to we ought to be. And as you're thinking about ROI and college guides and ratings and rankings and outcomes, I would love to hear how you define student success from all this great research and reporting you've done.
I appreciate the question. And I think, like, for a long time, I was very much interested in higher ed in terms of what's happening on campus and the ways in which higher education reflects and maybe even sustains our image of what our society is about and what it can be. And that gets into questions about upward mobility. And sometimes some people don't like this term, but I still think the old fashioned idea of meritocracy and the idea of this is something particularly distinctly American about the idea that you ought to be able to advance and grow and get ahead based on what you do, what you learn, what you're able to accomplish, not accidents of birth. I think higher ed is very much wrapped up in all of that. And so when it comes to student success, I've gotten very interested in the way that economists think about education and the idea of building human capital, the kinds of skills that we learn to do, ways that we learn to think. A fancy way of saying it is habits of mind, which I think are really fundamental to a high quality education. So when I think about student success, partly for my book research, I became much more interested in the question of how education connects to careers and jobs. And that doesn't mean you have to turn away from the things like the search for big ideas and the quest for the truth and these fundamental ideas of what a university is. But I think that what I've come to conclude is that we really need this combination of several different things that we think you could almost think of as the ingredients for a balanced diet in education that leads to student success and a healthy career. And I define those in the career arts as a mixture of very broad education. And those are everything from critical thinking, ability to communicate, ability to work with others, ability to analyze and synthesize information, and to navigate change over time. But you combine that kind of broad education with the targeted skills, which could be everything from nursing to teaching to accounting to something that is a very specific targeted skill that a certain employer is going to want for sure and in their employees. And then the third is the idea of social capital, which is one way of simplifying that is just to talk about building networks, human relationships, and how that's a really fundamental part of success because it's like the broad skills and the targeted skills are necessary, but they're not sufficient. In order to take those skills and put them into action in the world of work, you need to know people who can both give you information about what's out there, but who can also get to know you and vouch for you. And that's really how most people's careers kind of progress. It's a combination of the things that they know and the people that they've met and how they're able to combine those to put them into action in a particular career. So that's one way to think about student success.
Rejecting the false dichotomy of getting a education and getting a job, I think is so powerful, and seeing those as connected. In my own education, I started off in architecture and design and then ended up in strategy. But one of the formative books was Robert Venturi's Complexity and Contradiction in Architecture. And he talks all about it's not either or, it's both. And I think your book is, and your approach is such a great example of that because it isn't that you have to choose between big ideas and broad education and getting your Salesforce certification, getting a very targeted practical skill. Like you can do both of those.
Absolutely. I'm in the Washington, D.C. area, so I'm at least on the edge of all the political world. And there was a presidential primary debate a few cycles back where some candidate talked about how we need more welders and fewer philosophers. And so it buys into this whole kind of false choice that it's either the kind of obscure ivory tower stuff or it's do something kind of work with your hands and do something super practical. And of course, we just know that's not how the world works. And that still, honestly, that still persists. If you look at all the public opinion data that's come out about how people think about higher education, Americans' deep skepticism that's emerged
Yeah.
about the value of college. You can look at it in some Gallup polling just in the last 5 years, going from maybe like 57% confidence in the value of higher education back in 2015, and 10 years later, it's been about 36% in the last couple of Gallup polls. And that's unfortunately been reflected not just in what people tell pollsters, but in their behavior. We've had a significant drop in university enrollment. There's been some improvement this last year, but I think it's still not back to the pre-COVID levels. And I think that is unfortunately something we see a lot in our national discussion where the both and applies not just to this mixture of kind of what you could be doing in college or whatever path you take. But people tend to think, or they even will say explicitly, oh, we need many more shorter, cheaper, targeted programs. People still talk about things like coding boot camps as if somehow that's a better alternative to college. But of course, one of the paradoxes of the rise of AI is that coding boot camps are one of the first things to be made obsolete because AI can do so much of the basic coding. I think that we really need to have a reset where our both and applies in a big picture way to improving college and particularly improving persistence rates, which we know are very disappointingly low, completion rates, but also coming up with higher quality alternatives so that, yes, we should have more shorter, cheaper, faster alternatives for those who want them. But we should be looking at ways to combine those. There's a lot of talk about stackable credentials. And we should also be looking at ways to give better support to students who are in college to make sure they make it through. We can do both.
Yeah, increasingly, if you talk to recruiters or you talk to hiring managers on the employment side, it's not that they're seeing a certificate as an alternative to a degree. It's a differentiator in addition to a degree, right? They would rather people have a 4-year degree and a certificate or some kind of certification or a badge or a something that shows not only do I have these durable skills about communication and critical thinking and collaboration, but yes, I also know HubSpot or whatever it might be.
Absolutely. I'm sure you're all about this, but University of Texas system has a partnership now with Coursera to do micro credentials. And micro credentials have been something that have drawn a lot of interest. There's fairly loose definitions, but essentially short, very short little bits of knowledge and skills that somebody can get. But the idea there is, again, exactly as you said, that you might be majoring in something like, I'll say, comparative literature, since that was my major, that doesn't tend to be associated with like super high earnings right out of school, but maybe you get a data analytics micro credential. Maybe you do something else that has a much more practical cast. And that's just a way to help you navigate the needs of the moment with what are sometimes called the durable skills, with the transversal skills is another kind of jargony word for it, but the idea of those skills that are going to hold you in good stead for your fourth and your fifth and your sixth job.
Using your balanced diet analogy, it's not a mix of grains and proteins and fruits and vegetables. It sounds like it's broad education, targeted skills, social capital. I would love to hear how do those play out on a campus or online? Like how do students acquire those, learn those, experience those, and what role does that play in student success?
One way to think about it is that, of course, there are many different variations on the student experience, but very broadly speaking, we have evolved this system in the United States where we have sort of general education taking various forms, but the idea that, part of what you should get, even if you're going to be studying biology or accounting or computer science, you'll probably have to take some English, maybe you'll take a foreign language, maybe you'll have to get some exposure to social sciences and humanities and so forth. So some of that falls under the heading of the broad education we associate with the liberal arts tradition. I certainly would never claim that it's perfectly implemented and executed at every college. I'm personally partial to the very traditional great books, core curriculum approach, but certainly whatever form it takes, at many of the large public state institutions, which is, after all, where most Americans go, right? It's not the Ivies and so forth. They will still have general ed requirements. And so that means if you're learning how to write, and we hope learning something about how to think and how to assess information, that's certainly part of those broad skills. But we also know that contrary to the ivory tower stereotype, right? Huge percentage of the most popular majors are like business is the most popular major, some combination of things like accounting and marketing and finance, but also things like computer science, of course, has gotten way more popular. Things like teaching, things like accounting, those are very targeted in many cases. And I would say, particularly, there's a lot more interest in what's sometimes called experiential learning or even work-based learning. And that, again, can take many forms. But the idea that getting some work experience, whether it's through a paid job or a summer job or an internship, but something that allows you to do a little bit of that translation between classroom theory and real world practice as part of your educational path. I think that's increasingly being recognized as something many students in polls say they would like that. Unfortunately, not as many of them get that as we'd like, particularly lower income students, minority students are less likely to have those experiences. So I think that's something that we're increasingly hearing about. So what I would say is that A college campus is in some ways can be an ideal package of those three things where you get the broad education, you get the targeted skills, and social capital can just be the networks that you build on campus. But of course, we know perfectly well that doesn't happen automatically in every school. And there's been a lot of effort. In my book, I had a whole chapter on social capital and did a sort of spin-off excerpt in the Wall Street Journal weekend section about this. There are organizations like Braven, which is a nonprofit that works with first generation low income students on basically helping create programs while they're still in college that help teach them techniques that will help them get a really good first job out of college. And that's very heavily focused on social capital. Researching my book, I went up to Newark, New Jersey. I went to Rutgers University's Newark campus, big state school. The whole school is a very broad based student body, but at the Newark campus, a lot more students on Pell Grants, a lot of students from more modest backgrounds. And those who are working with Braven, like I met a guy who's about, I think he immigrated to the States as a teenager from Macedonia in Eastern Europe. His parents, I think his mom was a nighttime lab technician. His dad worked as a security guard. He felt like the way you had to get a job was your family had to know someone. Like that was his perception. So he was just blown away when he took a class with Braven, and they would teach him about things like informational interviews. That you could approach somebody who'd gone to your school, Rutgers, and say, "Hey, I'm interested in your field." This guy was interested in law enforcement. And you could say, you're not asking them for a job. You're just saying, "Hey, would you have 20 minutes to talk to me about your field?" And that not always, but surprisingly often, that kind of thing will work. And then there are many other schools that have variations on this where they'll bring in professionals for networking events. Sometimes it's very much on the academic side. I remember hearing about a woman at Wellesley College who's a neuroscientist, so classic, women's elite liberal arts college. But she brings in neuroscientists to her senior seminar, to a capstone seminar, just to talk to students about what are the things that you might do if you study neuroscience. And then on the other side of the country, in San Diego, California, there's a small school, Point Loma Nazarene, religiously affiliated liberal arts college, a lot of first generation students, a lot of parents who are very skeptical about what exactly is this liberal arts college going to do for my kid. They've taken their career office and they've put it under the provost's office. So what they are trying to do in part is to say that career preparation is part of the academic mission of the institution. I don't want to speak for them, but I believe there was an article that their provost wrote in Inside Higher Ed, basically saying you have to explain to the faculty that you're not compromising your principles by giving students, talking to them about the kinds of jobs that they might get.
No,
For
you're applying the principles.
Exactly. Like you might
Yeah.
study biology, let's say, in a fairly liberal arts context, academic subject. But San Diego has a huge, thriving biotech industry. And one of the things that they try to do is to show people that the graduates of this little liberal arts college can go off into all kinds of jobs. And they might not be a lab scientist at a biotech company, but they might be doing marketing or something. But their liberal arts background, their biology degree might really help them. And I think it's just showing people the possibilities that can exist is something that helps, to go back to your question, put together that mixture of ingredients, the broad education, the targeted skills, the social capital. That's something that colleges can really help with. But of course, not everyone goes to college. And I think if you don't go to college, there are also other ways to try and think about those. But it's more a matter of trying to play the long game. If you're a student or if you're just a young person who's working and you're thinking about what value do I bring to the world, I think it's important to try to remember that you want to keep some part of your value is your flexibility, your ability to adapt, your ability to learn new things. And it's not just like the particular coding language that's really popular now. When I was in college back in the dark ages, right, I took liberal arts education, right? So although I was studying literature, I took things like statistics and computer science. So I learned how to program a language called BASIC, which was popular at the time. I'm sure by the time I graduated, nobody was using BASIC anymore and they were on to some other language. So that's always the challenge, right? Is these skills have what's sometimes called a very short half-life. You feel like you're up to date with the latest thing, but all of a sudden it's obsolete. So you need to know, and of course we can bring AI into this, but you need to know, I think, how to learn. And we talk sometimes about the human in the loop in the context of all the tech stuff that's going on, but how can you develop the kind of good judgment that is going to help you give better guidance, get better prompts to AI, to make sense of when it's doing something useful, how it could be improved, some different questions you could ask it, and how to tell when it's hallucinating something. Because obviously
Right.
you've developed a good sort of gut check or BS meter. That's all part of what you, I think, want to be thinking about in terms of your own personal development.
Yeah, it's such a powerful combination. And the social capital to me is almost like a sort of the multiplier of the broad education and the targeted skills you're talking about, and it really unlocks so much of the potential. You hear stories and you talk to people, and the relationships are really what make such a difference in terms of someone's sense of belonging and in terms of their sense of identity, in terms of a real world project or an internship. That might be the way you meet your future self. It's like when you meet a market researcher that your stats class comes alive because now you can see how you might apply it or through that informational interview. So I really appreciate the focus on the social capital as part of that, as part of the mix. And I wonder what's holding institutions back from doing more of this? What's keeping them from building social capital or targeted skills or broad education?
I think that the broad education and the targeted skills, you could say, I think that's probably not that it's perfect. I think a lot of unfair criticisms are made of US higher education, but there's some that are very fair. Some of it is on the issues of free and open inquiry, and just particularly so at some of the elites that I think have fallen short in creating the kind of campus atmosphere where there really is a lot of rigorous open debate and we don't have cancel culture and so on. But it's also true that just getting people to persist to graduation is a mixed bag. Some places are doing much better than others. Obviously, different student populations. It's not such a great accomplishment for Harvard to have a 90, whatever, 97% graduation rate because of the students they enroll. But
And the resources they have, yeah. I mean, the
correct.
spend
And
per student.
correct. But even there have been among places that are much more, have similar numbers of Pell students, lower income students, first generation college students. There's a difference between those who are getting 65% to graduate and those who are doing 40 or 45%. And I think those are things that colleges could pay a lot more attention to. But I would say the social capital, of the three things that I talk about, that's the one that I think colleges have been slowest to embrace. And I think part
Right.
of it is that there's still a bit of a perception, both among students and among maybe college administrators, that it's something either you've got it or you don't. That you either it's an accident of birth. But I think the key shift is to think about social capital as a skill that can be taught. And that's what all these places I mentioned Braven. There's also another place called Co-op Careers, does very well. There's a place called Basta that works on social capital. And some of them work with colleges, some of them work in parallel. But I think the idea of thinking about building social capital as a discrete skill and a teachable skill is something that just not enough colleges have embraced. As I said, there are some great examples out there, but I think it's been a little slower. And I think it's a little bit in the same way that some professors are concerned and dubious about the idea that their job is not to be job training coaches. They worry about it getting a sort of excessively vocational cast. But I think that part of the solution to that is just acknowledging if you're there to serve your students, yeah, if you're an English professor, you don't have to become a vocational instructor, but you may be able to talk to them about how the skills that you learn through analyzing literature and writing the kinds of essays you do are maybe something where whether it's skills and jobs in whether it's going to law school or jobs in marketing or advertising or all kinds of things where the ability to be comfortable with language and communication is going to be useful. And that's a goes back to what I said before. That's not somehow compromising your principles or betraying your mission. I think it's just taking a broader approach. And I think that's something in general, colleges, I think, that have done well with supporting student success, I think have taken a sort of big tent approach to what they can do for students, knowing how much students really value, they almost crave the kind of guidance and advice they can get, particularly from professors and
Yeah.
from generally speaking from other kinds of college leaders.
Yeah, I think it's so smart to focus on that. And it could just be embracing active learning and group projects in the classroom. So students are meeting each other as opposed to listening to a lecture on their own, or it could be like a career development course that's integrated into the curriculum. It could be the real world projects we've been talking about or the internships, but these things that where you're not just like building the skills, but you're building relationships, I think is really critical. To wrap up, I would love to hear you've talked about how these things are changing as people are embracing the career arts and they're trying to make the kind of college to career connection. There are lots of curveballs coming our way, AI or public perception or demographic cliffs or declining enrollments. What's your advice for college and universities to adapt to these changes and help students succeed?
I think, well, I mean, to some extent, and of course, we know we're all kind of watching to see what's going to happen with the impact of AI on and things like entry-level jobs. There's a lot of kind of early analysis. You could almost call them hot takes, but I think it's just too soon to know for sure because there's so many variables out there and changes in the economy to know for sure. But I think right now, I guess the first thing is there's a very robust evidence base that really shows the economic value of college. It's not even a close call. The Claudia Golden, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics a few years ago, talks about the 20th century when there was a massive increase in both high school graduation rates and then college attendance. She calls it the human capital century. And we know that college graduates on average are earning about 75% more than people who only have high school diplomas. So I think that people are very focused on picking apart. Yes, of course, that's true. That's only for those who graduate, and yes, that there's some variation by major, what subject you studied. But the fact is, the big picture is there is just an incredible evidence base for the value of college. It just does not line up with the public skepticism, and so I feel like there's a lot more that colleges could be doing. Not to say that they're perfect, and God knows colleges could do a lot to improve on some of the areas I've talked about. But I think just simply feeling confident that telling someone to go to college, particularly if they can complete college, is really solid advice. And some of the alternatives, I think, have been excessively hyped. There's a study from the Burning Glass Institute. Matt Siegelman is the main author. I think it's also in combination with the American Enterprise Institute. And it's about these very short-term credentials that have sometimes been really hyped up as an alternative to college, short, cheap, practical. But they did an analysis looking at the earnings benefit of many of these credentials. They looked at like a huge number, and I think they came up with this really shocking statistic, like only 12% actually create enough of a sort of earnings boost compared to a similar person who did not acquire that credential to really make them worthwhile. And then you
That's
could
not a
add
lot
some
of
additional,
ROI.
yeah,
Yeah,
that's
or
not a lot of
not
ROI.
a high likelihood of ROI.
That's right. And then they add some other things like maybe not earnings, but like creating a better pathway for other jobs. Maybe you can get up to a third of them, provide some pretty decent return. So fair enough. I'm not against those credentials, but I think you have to learn to separate the wheat from the chaff. And I think we are excessively critical of a very demonstrated path to educational and career success, which is college and all the different forms it takes. And I think we've been excessively credulous about these short-term credentials, which as we start seeing more evidence come out, are something, again, not that you should stay away from. Maybe it's a good sort of place to get started if you are maybe a less of a traditional student, you're less certain of your abilities. If we can really figure out a way to stack those credentials and combine them into bigger degrees, I think that would be great. But I think that colleges should feel, I think they should feel confident in what they're doing. They should do a better job of getting students to completion. I think the culture wars are a very complex thing for any individual institution to fight. But I guess I would say to the extent there has been a problem with the sort of robust debate and free expression on campus, I think that's something colleges need to really address squarely. That feeds into the public perception, but in many cases, it's much simpler than that. It's really, whether it's community colleges, open access, regional publics, those are places that just need to do a better job of taking care of
Right.
students, helping give them guidance, treating them as human beings, acknowledging the complicated lives that they live, trying to provide the kinds of services that are going to be supportive to them, and also making the case to the students that, yeah, a practical degree is great, but don't forget the long game. You want to try and make sure you have those skills that are going to help you navigate a long career. And I think that's a package that it really is a proven package. And I think it's something colleges can do more with.
I love it. I love the both and method. You've got the long game, the short game, you've got the education, you've got the career, and I appreciate this balanced both and approach you're taking and how you're bridging these divides so students can succeed. So thanks, Ben.
Thank you, Elliot. It was great to have a chance to talk about it with you.
Thanks for listening to the Connected College podcast. Subscribe to my Connected College newsletter at elliottfelix.com for insights and excerpts from my upcoming book, tools you can download, and special offers. You can also find more information about talks I've given, articles I've written, and upcoming events there. And please support the podcast by rating and reviewing it wherever you're listening. Let's create connected colleges where students will succeed.